Bryson DeChambeau has said it himself, on the record, it is not really about Brian Rolapp. It is about whether the membership wants him back. That single sentence, spoken in an interview with Scratch, cuts through months of speculation about DeChambeau's future with the PGA Tour. It reframes the entire conversation. This is not simply a negotiation between one player and one commissioner. It is a question of whether the players who make up the PGA Tour's membership are willing to vote a man back into their ranks after he became the lead plaintiff in an antitrust lawsuit against the very organization he wants to rejoin. Here is the situation as it actually stands. The PGA Tour's biggest individual content generator, a player with a YouTube channel north of 3 million subscribers, is also the man whose name sits atop the legal filing that challenged the Tour's authority in federal court. Reconciling those two facts is the central problem facing both DeChambeau and the Tour's leadership. Three real obstacles stand between DeChambeau and a return to the PGA Tour: the timing of his contract with LIV Golf, the Tour's content and social media policy, and the internal politics of a membership that has already watched him decline one offered path back. Each of these deserves examination on its own terms, because together they explain why this story is far more complicated than a simple, will he or won't he. How we got here. DeChambeau left the PGA Tour for LIV Golf in 2022, signing a deal reported to be worth approximately $100 million. The move made him one of the most prominent defectors in a wave of player departures that reshaped professional golf's competitive landscape. Shortly after signing with LIV, DeChambeau became the lead plaintiff in the antitrust lawsuit filed against the PGA Tour, a legal action that argued the Tour's rules and eligibility restrictions violated federal antitrust law. That lawsuit is a critical piece of context. It means DeChambeau's relationship with the PGA Tour is not simply that of a departed player who might one day want to come home. He is the individual whose legal challenge questioned the Tour's fundamental operating structure. That history does not disappear simply because a player expresses interest in returning. Compare his position to that of Brooks Koepka. Koepka also left for LIV Golf, but his path back into PGA Tour competition, when he has played Tour events, came through the Tour's returning member program, a formal mechanism designed to allow players to requalify for membership under specific conditions. DeChambeau was offered a similar route and declined it. That decision matters enormously for understanding the current standoff, because it means the Tour has already extended one formal olive branch, and DeChambeau chose not to take it on the terms offered. Understanding the man now steering the Tour's response requires some background as well. Brian Rolapp joined the PGA Tour as commissioner after a career as a media executive with the NFL, where he oversaw the league's media rights and broadcasting strategy. Since taking over as commissioner, Rolapp has stated priorities centered on building a more sustainable, financially rational competitive structure for the Tour, one less dependent on any single player's presence or absence. What Rolapp is actually building. The most concrete piece of information regarding the Tour's future structure is Rolapp's proposed two-track model. Under this plan, roughly 16 tournaments would make up a top competitive tier, referred to as Track 1, reserved for the Tour's highest-ranked and most consistent performers. A second tier, Track 2, would function as a feeder circuit, a pathway through which players could earn their way into the top tier based on performance. This restructuring would also restore 36-hole cuts to tournaments, a format element that has been reduced or eliminated in a number of current PGA Tour events, particularly the elevated, no-cut tournaments that emerged as part of the Tour's response to competition from LIV Golf. The target rollout for this new structure has been discussed for around 2028, giving the Tour several years to implement the changes and adjust scheduling, sponsorship, and media agreements accordingly. For a player in DeChambeau's position, this restructuring carries direct implications. Field size under a two-track system would be different from the current model. Purse structure and status within the Tour would depend on which track a player qualifies for and how that qualification is determined. A player returning under this new system would not simply be slotting back into the Tour as it existed when he left in 2022. He would be entering a fundamentally reorganized competitive environment, one where his position would need to be established under new rules rather than grandfathered in from his prior tour membership. Rolapp has publicly framed this restructuring effort in terms that emphasize institutional durability over individual star power. He has described the goal as building a system that outlives any single player. That framing is significant. It signals that the tour's current leadership is not designing its competitive structure around accommodating any one returning star, DeChambeau included. The system is meant to function regardless of which individual players are or are not part of it. The real sticking points. The first major sticking point is timing, and specifically, leverage. LIV Golf's financial backing comes from Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. Reports have indicated that this backing arrangement, at least in its current contractual form, is set to conclude after the 2026 season. DeChambeau's own contract with LIV Golf is also reported to expire around the same time, at the end of 2026. This convergence is often discussed as though it strengthens DeChambeau's negotiating position, as if the approaching contract expiration gives him more options and therefore more leverage in any conversation with the PGA Tour. But the actual dynamic works in something closer to the opposite direction. If LIV Golf's financial backing structure changes or diminishes after 2026, and if DeChambeau's contract with the league ends at the same time, he could find himself without a lucrative alternative to fall back on, rather than holding a stronger hand. A player negotiating a return to competitive golf while his other major option is uncertain or disappearing is not necessarily negotiating from strength. He may simply be negotiating because his alternatives have narrowed. The second sticking point is the tour's content policy, and this is where DeChambeau's own public statements become directly relevant. He has identified the PGA Tour's rules governing social media activity and content creation at tournament events as a significant obstacle to any potential return. This is not a minor administrative detail for DeChambeau. His YouTube channel has grown to approximately 3 million subscribers, built substantially around content series such as Break 50, in which he attempts to shoot a competitive round under a specific low score while documenting the process for his audience. That channel represents an independent revenue stream, separate from tournament winnings, sponsorship deals negotiated through the tour, or any LIV Golf contract. A PGA Tour policy that restricts what kind of content a player can film, when they can film it, or how they can distribute it during tournament weeks would directly constrain a media operation DeChambeau has built largely on his own terms since leaving the traditional tour structure. For a player whose content business has become a substantial part of his public profile and, presumably, his income, tour rules on this front are not a peripheral concern. They go to the core of how he currently operates as a public figure in golf. The third sticking point is what might be called the precedent problem. As already noted, Rolapp's organization, through the returning member program, already offered DeChambeau a formal route back onto the PGA Tour. He turned it down. That refusal creates a genuine complication for any future negotiation. If the tour were to now offer DeChambeau a different, perhaps more favorable, path back, one not available through the standard returning member program that other players like Koepka have used, it raises a fairness question within the locker room. Why would one player who initially declined the standard process be granted different terms than players who either used that process or never left at all? This is not simply a matter of DeChambeau's personal negotiation with tour leadership. It is a matter of how any special arrangement would be perceived, and accepted, by the rest of the membership. The membership question. This brings the conversation back to the quote that opened this entire discussion. In DeChambeau's own words, from his interview with Scratch, "I don't even think it's Brian Rolapp, it's really if the players want me back." This is worth sitting with directly, because it is DeChambeau himself identifying where the real decision-making power lies. Under PGA Tour governance structures, significant decisions, including matters related to player eligibility and membership, involve input and approval from the Tour's Player Advisory Council and its Policy Board, both of which are made up substantially of active Tour players. Rolapp, as commissioner, operates within a structure that requires buy-in from the membership on matters of this significance. DeChambeau's comment reflects an accurate read of that structure. This is not a decision Rolapp can simply make unilaterally, even if he wanted to. That distinction matters because DeChambeau's relationship with the current PGA Tour membership is not the same as his relationship with golf fans. Public sentiment toward DeChambeau, particularly around his YouTube content and his attempts to grow the game's audience through platforms like Break 50, has often been favorable. He has built a substantial and engaged following. But the antitrust lawsuit he led against the PGA Tour was, by definition, an adversarial legal action against the organization and, by extension, against the collective interests of the players who remained on tour and depend on its structure, purses, and media deals for their livelihoods. Players who stayed on the PGA Tour through the LIV Golf split, who did not take guaranteed money to leave, and who watched a lawsuit challenge the very organization providing their competitive platform, may not view DeChambeau's potential return the same way golf fans do. Fan approval and player approval are two different things, and DeChambeau's own quote suggests he understands this distinction clearly. This raises a genuine, unresolved question. Would a majority of current PGA Tour members actually vote to bring DeChambeau back under any circumstances, given his role in that lawsuit? There is no public polling of the membership on this specific question, and it would be speculative to claim a definitive answer either way. What can be said is that this question is central to whatever happens next, more central, according to DeChambeau's own framing, than any specific policy negotiated with Rolapp's front office. 2 paths forward. Based on the elements laid out here, there are 2 realistic outcomes that reporting on this situation tends to point toward. The first path involves LIV Golf securing new or continued financial backing beyond the 2026 cutoff currently associated with its public investment fund arrangement. Under this scenario, DeChambeau would remain with LIV Golf, continuing to compete on that circuit while also continuing to build his independent media brand through his YouTube channel and associated content ventures. In this path, the question of a PGA Tour return becomes less urgent, since DeChambeau would retain a stable and lucrative competitive and financial home outside the tour structure entirely. The second path involves the opposite outcome. LIV Golf's current financial structure changes substantially or the league's operations contract in some way after 2026. In this scenario, DeChambeau would have considerably less leverage than he might currently appear to hold. Any conversation about returning to the PGA Tour would then take place on terms largely set by the tour itself, through Rolapp's proposed 2-track system and whatever eligibility rules the membership establishes, rather than on terms DeChambeau could negotiate from a position of strength. These 2 paths are not framed here as a dramatic conflict or a war of wills between 2 men in a room. They represent the 2 outcomes that available reporting on LIV Golf's financial situation and DeChambeau's contract timeline actually point toward. The determining factor is not a personal standoff between DeChambeau and Rolapp. It is the financial future of LIV Golf's backing structure, a matter largely outside either man's direct control. Why this matters beyond DeChambeau? This situation extends beyond one player's individual circumstances. It reflects a broader tension within professional golf between a PGA Tour that has become increasingly structured around media rights deals, sponsorship value, and a corporatized competitive model under Rolapp's leadership, and players who have built independent, personality-driven audiences and revenue streams separate from the tour's traditional structure. DeChambeau's content policy dispute is not necessarily unique to him. Other players who have built social media followings, YouTube channels, or independent content businesses face similar questions about how much creative and commercial freedom the PGA Tour's rules allow during tournament competition. As more players build audiences and income streams independent of tour purses and traditional sponsorship deals, the tension between individual content businesses and tour-wide media policy is likely to become a recurring issue, not one confined to DeChambeau's specific situation. Rolapp's stated goal, a competitive system that outlives any individual player, stands somewhat in tension with a sport where individual personalities, including DeChambeau's, have become significant drivers of audience engagement and revenue, both for the tour and independently. How the PGA Tour navigates that tension, between institutional structure and individual star power, will shape not just whether DeChambeau returns, but how the tour manages its relationship with every player who has built something valuable outside its traditional framework.